My name is Sylvia Morgan. I am 68 years old, a retired high school English teacher who spent her entire life raising a family and standing quietly behind my husband's success. For decades, I was the one who kept our home warm, who held birthdays together, who mended broken hearts in silence. People called me dependable, gentle, patient, but I never thought I would one day be discarded like a piece of unwanted furniture by the very son I had poured my life into. It happened right after my husband Richard's funeral. The flowers were still fresh at the graveside when my son, Daniel, looked me in the eye and said words that will never leave me. "Mom, the penthouse and the $45 million are mine now. You're old and useless. We don't need you anymore. Go away." Just like that. No hesitation, no compassion. His wife, Melissa, stood behind him with her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a smile that was sharper than any knife. My knees nearly gave out. I had buried my husband hours before, and now my only child was burying me emotionally. After my husband's funeral, my son inherited our penthouse and $45 million. Then he threw me out. His voice was cold as winter when he said, "We don't need you anymore. Go away." That sentence struck me harder than any storm I had ever weathered. I looked around the penthouse I had called home for over 40 years. The walls still carried the laughter of dinner parties, the echoes of Richard's voice reading poetry on quiet nights, the soft footsteps of Daniel as a boy running down the hallway. Every corner was a memory, yet in that moment, none of it mattered. To Daniel and Melissa, I was nothing but an obstacle, a burden they were eager to remove. I packed 2 suitcases with trembling hands, my life, my sacrifices, reduced to worn clothes and a box of family photos. Melissa stood by the door tapping her manicured nails against her phone as if I were making her late for something important. Daniel avoided my eyes. When I stepped out into the hallway, clutching the suitcases that felt heavier than my entire body, I paused to look back one last time. The penthouse sparkled with the kind of sterile luxury Melissa adored. It no longer looked like mine. It no longer felt like home. I carried those bags down to the street. The doorman, who had known me for years, lowered his gaze, too embarrassed to speak. I stood on the sidewalk, the city buzzing indifferently around me, while my son closed the chapter of my life with a single cruel dismissal. I will never forget the sound of the door shutting behind me. That click was louder than any gunshot. It was the sound of betrayal, final and absolute. For 2 nights I stayed in a cheap roadside motel, the kind with peeling wallpaper and thin towels. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart aching not only for the husband I had just lost, but for the son I realized I had never truly known. I thought I had reached the end of everything, but I was wrong. Because 2 days later, I sat in a lawyer's office, clutching my handbag like a lifeline, when Charles Bennett, my husband's longtime attorney, leaned across his desk and asked a question that made my heart pound in disbelief. Did Daniel ever actually read the will? I blinked at him, not understanding. And then Charles smiled, almost incredulous. "Your son's jaw is going to drop, Sylvia, because the will says something very different from what he told you." That was the moment my world shifted again. My grief turned into something else. A slow fire of clarity and justice began to rise. Before I tell you exactly what the will revealed, let me pause for a moment. If you are listening to my story right now, it is because you believe, like me, that life is not always fair, but justice has a way of showing up when you least expect it. Subscribe and join me here, because stories like this are not just entertainment. They are reminders that none of us are ever truly powerless. And I promise you, this one will take turns you cannot imagine. When Charles asked if Daniel had even read the will, a spark of hope lit inside me. But before I could get to that point, I need to take you back to the moment I actually walked out of the penthouse for the last time. The memory still burns in my mind like a brand pressed against the skin. Melissa stood at the elevator holding the door open, her eyes sliding over me with disdain. She looked me up and down as if I were a stranger trespassing in her home, not the woman who had once rocked her husband to sleep as a child. She tilted her head, lips curling into the faintest smile, and pressed the button. As the elevator doors closed in front of me, she gave me one last look, sharp and satisfied, as though she had won some unspoken war. That look followed me down all 30 floors. My son did not even walk me out. He remained inside the apartment, already discussing renovation plans for his penthouse, his voice echoing through the hall like I had been nothing more than hired help leaving after a shift. Each word was a dagger. I clutched 2 suitcases that felt heavier than mountains. But more than the suitcases, what weighed me down was the small wooden frame I carried pressed against my chest. It was our wedding photo, taken on a golden afternoon nearly 5 decades earlier. Richard stood tall in his suit, his smile boyish and proud, while I leaned into him, radiant with a faith in the future we were about to build. That photo had hung above our fireplace since the day we moved in. Now it was the only anchor I had left. Outside, the doorman avoided my eyes. He had known me for years, greeted me every morning, held umbrellas over my head when it rained. Yet now he pretended to study the sidewalk as if embarrassed to witness my humiliation. I wanted to scream, to ask him if he remembered the countless Christmas bonuses Richard and I had given him, the warm cookies I had sent down each holiday, but I said nothing. Silence wrapped around me like a shroud. The city was alive that evening, indifferent to the collapse of my world. Taxis honked, people hurried past carrying shopping bags, neon lights blinked across the street. And there I stood, 68 years old, a widow with nothing but 2 suitcases and a fading photograph. I remember thinking how strange it was that the world kept moving when mine had stopped. I walked 2 blocks before my legs gave out. I sank onto a bench, clutching the photograph so tightly my knuckles turned white. My reflection stared back at me from the glass frame. The woman who looked at me was tired, hollow-eyed, but still standing. I whispered to Richard's image, "You promised I would never be alone. Where are you now?" A gust of wind rattled the leaves overhead, almost like a whisper in response. But of course, there was only silence. When I finally checked into a cheap motel on the edge of the city, the clerk barely glanced at me. I handed over cash with trembling fingers, and he slid a key across the counter as if I were just another traveler passing through. The hallway smelled of mildew, and the carpet was worn thin from years of footsteps. Inside the room, the wallpaper peeled at the corners, the mattress sagged in the middle, and the single lamp flickered with a weary glow. I placed the wedding photo on the nightstand. Its presence was both comfort and torment. I lay down on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of muffled television leaking through the thin walls. All night, I replayed Daniel's words in my mind. "We don't need you anymore. Go away." They echoed like church bells tolling the death of everything I had ever believed in. My heart clenched each time, and I felt as if I were mourning not only Richard, but also the son I had lost to greed. At dawn, I sat by the small window watching the city wake up. Delivery trucks roared past, children in uniforms walked with their parents, life unfolding as though my pain were invisible. I pressed the photo frame against my chest and whispered again, "Richard, what did you leave me with? Did you really believe our son would protect me?" The second night in that room was worse. My grief turned to anger, then back to grief again. I could not eat. I could not sleep. I felt trapped in a nightmare with no exit. Yet in the stillness, a thought began to form. Richard had always been meticulous about his affairs. He never left anything to chance. He had shown me documents before, explained his wishes, assured me that I would be safe. If what Daniel claimed was true, something did not add up. I looked at the wedding photo one more time, tracing Richard's face with my finger, and in that fragile moment, I made a choice. I would not let my son's betrayal be the final chapter of my life. If there was truth hidden somewhere, I would find it. That decision carried me through the rest of the night. 2 days later, I walked into Charles Bennett's office, exhausted but determined, ready to learn the truth. That was when he leaned forward, eyes sharp with surprise, and asked the question that made everything unravel. Did Daniel ever actually read the will? Before Charles asked whether Daniel had read the will, there were 2 nights that changed me. I spent them in a cheap motel that smelled of damp carpet and lemon cleaner, the kind that keeps its curtains shut at noon. The lock stuck. The ice machine coughed. The bedside lamp hummed with a tired buzz. I set my suitcases on a chair and placed our wedding photo on the nightstand. Richard's grin beamed from the frame, while my younger face leaned toward his. 2 kids pledging forever without knowing how fast forever can move. I touched the glass and felt steadier than the mattress beneath me. I thought about the road that led me here. I taught high school English until Daniel was born. Then I left the classroom to stretch every dollar and soothe every cry. While Richard built his firm, I kept the household moving with the discipline of a captain at sea. I made recipes that lasted 2 nights. I tracked forms and appointments. I turned small money into a stable home. When paychecks tightened, I graded essays or watched neighbors' children in the evenings. It never felt small. It felt like love made practical, the quiet backbone of a life. When Richard's parents grew frail, I moved them into our spare room and learned the language of pills and appointments. I washed sheets, warmed soup, measured time by gentle tasks that never make the news but keep the world from breaking. When the firm lost its biggest client, I took temp shifts at a call center under fluorescent lights that made everyone look a little seasick. I came home with a headache and kept going. I believed Daniel was watching. I believed he would grow into a man who understood that loyalty is built in ordinary days. The television next door murmured through the thin wall that first night. I lay on my back and counted a crack in the ceiling until my eyes burned. I tried to pray. Only dry air answered. The elevator scene replayed, Melissa's glance sliding over me with casual contempt, doors closing like a mouth swallowing a secret. My grief for Richard braided with a new grief for the son I no longer recognized. I lifted the photo and pressed it to my chest. The glass was cool, the memory warm, the promise uncertain. Morning arrived with delivery trucks and gulls circling the dumpster. I brewed instant coffee with tap water and drank it lukewarm. I opened my suitcase and made the room tidy because neatness has always been my raft. Then I took inventory. I had modest savings, a small credit line, and a few pieces of jewelry I could sell. I wrote numbers on the motel notepad and counted days instead of dollars. As I slid the paper into my purse, my fingers found the corner of a business card. Heavy stock, raised letters, Charles Bennett, attorney at law. He had handled our closings and contracts for years. He sent holiday cards signed in blue ink and ate a second slice of my lemon bars. After one meeting, in a quiet elevator, Richard had said, "If anything happens, talk to Charles first. He knows where every document lives. He will not let you drift." I told Richard he would outlive us all. Life did not grant that comfort. I set the card beside the photo like 2 small lighthouses. Hope stepped forward. Fear stepped back. Then fear returned with a sharper edge. What if Daniel had been right? The second evening fell early. The room smelled of fried onions from a diner across the street. I bought a cup of soup and could not taste it. I sat on the bed with the photo in my lap and breathed in steady counts. In, hold, out. I thought about the values we planted in Daniel. Work hard, tell the truth, protect the vulnerable, apologize without delay. At 8, with a split lip, he heard me say that kindness is strength without noise. At 16, returning late, he heard us say that trust is a currency, and he had overspent. Somewhere between those moments and the man at the elevator, something precious had been traded away. I turned the card and read the number. Richard was meticulous. He measured twice. He labeled folders with ruler straight tabs. He believed in redundancies. If truth lived in paper, it would be in Charles's files. At dawn, I showered, dressed, and slipped the photo into my tote. I dialed. The receptionist answered with brisk warmth, put me on hold, then offered noon. I left the key, stepped into a wind that smelled like rain, rode the bus past storefronts and playgrounds, and walked into Charles's building, ready to hear what the will actually said. I steadied my breathing again. Charles Bennett's office smelled faintly of leather and old books, the kind of room where order lived in tidy stacks of paper and brass lamps glowed with steady light. I sat in a chair that swallowed me whole, clutching my handbag as if it contained the last fragments of my dignity. My hands would not stop shaking. I was half afraid to hear the truth and half desperate for it. Charles entered with the same measured pace I remembered from years ago when Richard and I signed our mortgage papers. His hair had gone grayer, his suit darker, but his eyes still carried that calm weight that made people trust him. He leaned across the desk, adjusted his glasses, and said quietly, "Sylvia, I've been trying to reach you for days. Daniel told me you were too distraught to attend the reading of Richard's will." I felt my throat tighten. Reading of the will? I never knew there was one. His brows knit together. "You never received your copy?" I shook my head. Charles reached into a thick file folder and pulled out a bound set of documents. He placed them gently in front of me like a priest laying down scripture. Richard was meticulous. He updated his will 6 months before his passing. He wanted clarity. I opened the folder with trembling fingers. Richard's handwriting curved across the last page, familiar and steady, a signature I had seen on birthday cards and love notes and mortgage checks. Tears blurred my eyes as Charles began to read aloud. "To my beloved wife, Sylvia Morgan, I leave our primary residence, the penthouse at East 72nd Street, including all furnishings and personal effects. In addition, I leave her 70% of all financial assets, investments, and accounts, totaling approximately $31 million. The word struck me like a bell. My breath caught. 31 million. The penthouse, the furniture, everything we had built together. He had not abandoned me. He had thought of me, prepared for me, trusted me. Charles's voice grew firmer as he continued. To my son, Daniel Morgan, I leave 30% of the financial assets to be held in trust until his 40th birthday. Distribution is contingent upon his respectful and dignified treatment of his mother following my death. I gasped. Contingent upon his treatment of me. Charles nodded. Richard was clear. He worried about Daniel's sense of entitlement. He asked me to include that clause so there would be no misunderstanding. I leaned back, the chair suddenly too big, the room spinning gently around me. My son had not only thrown me out, in doing so, he had forfeited every cent left for him. Charles closed the folder and looked at me steadily. Sylvia, Daniel misled you. He lied about inheriting everything. He has already violated the very condition his inheritance depended upon. My mouth went dry. So what does that mean, legally? It means the trust is void. The 30% reverts to you immediately. Daniel has no legal claim to the penthouse or the assets. By mistreating you, he has effectively disinherited himself. I pressed a hand to my mouth. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. The very cruelty Daniel used to cast me aside was the blade that cut his own fortune away. He had destroyed himself with his greed, but laughter never came. Instead, grief welled up again, this time heavier, stranger. I thought of the little boy with scraped knees who once crawled into my lap for comfort, the young man I prayed over when he left for college. Had I failed him so completely that he believed love could be measured in square footage and zeros in a bank account? Charles's voice softened. I know this is difficult, but Richard wanted you protected. He saw what Daniel was becoming. He tried to build safeguards. I looked at the document again, the ink still dark, the words unyielding. My husband had trusted me with everything, and my son, blinded by arrogance, had slammed the door on himself. Tears fell onto the folder. Richard knew, I whispered. He knew this would happen. Charles handed me a handkerchief. He hoped it would not, but he prepared in case it did. I dabbed. My eyes inhaled deeply and forced myself to sit straighter. What do I do now? You take back your home. You notify the bank. You allow me to file the proper motions to freeze Daniel's access to any accounts he may have tried to touch. You reclaim what is yours. The idea felt almost impossible, like learning to breathe in a new atmosphere. But deep inside, something shifted. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I felt a thread of strength pull me upward. I gathered the papers into my handbag, my hand steadier than when I had arrived. Then let's do it. Charles studied me for a moment, a small smile forming. Richard would be proud. I rose from the chair, clutching the wedding photo tucked in my bag. In the reflection of Charles's office window, I saw myself not as the woman shivering on the sidewalk 2 nights before, but as someone still standing, still capable, still here. And as I stepped out of that office into the bright city afternoon, one thought carried me forward like a lantern in the dark. My son had tried to erase me, but in doing so, he had written me into the center of everything. I left Charles's office with the will tucked safely in my bag, my heart beating faster than it had in years. Relief mixed with dread. Relief that Richard had not abandoned me. Dread for what would happen when Daniel discovered the truth. I did not have to wait long. The city moves quickly, and so does justice when arrogance paves the way. 2 nights later, Daniel and Melissa threw a party in the penthouse that was no longer theirs. I was not invited, of course, but word traveled through neighbors who had watched guests in glittering dresses and sharp suits stream through the lobby. Daniel wanted the world to see his triumph. He wanted applause for a fortune he believed was secured. I imagined him standing in the great room, raising a glass of champagne, his voice carrying across the marble floors. He would have bragged about the $45 million, about the penthouse renovations he planned, about how he was finally free from the shadow of his parents. Melissa would have laughed too loudly at his jokes, her diamonds catching the chandelier light, every gesture screaming victory, but arrogance invites witnesses. That evening, as their guests settled in, sipping vintage wine and nibbling hors d'oeuvres, the sound of the elevator opening brought in not another friend, but 2 men in dark suits accompanied by a uniformed officer. A hush fell over the room. Glasses froze mid-air. Someone coughed nervously. The taller man spoke with practiced authority. "Mr. Daniel Morgan?" Daniel stepped forward, still holding his champagne flute, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Yes, what is this about?" The man pulled a file from his briefcase. "We are representatives of your father's estate and the Morgan family bank. As of this evening, all accounts you attempted to access have been frozen pending verification. Furthermore, the penthouse you are occupying is not your legal property. It belongs to Mrs. Sylvia Morgan, your mother." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush marble. Melissa's face drained of color. "There must be a mistake," she stammered. "We were told—" The officer interrupted. "Ma'am, there is no mistake. Legal documentation confirms the assets were never transferred to your name." Daniel laughed, the brittle kind of laugh people use when panic scrapes at their throat. "That's impossible. I inherited everything. The man closed the file with a snap. The will left 70% to your mother. Your share was conditional. By mistreating her, you nullified any claim." Gasps rippled through the guests. One woman set down her drink and whispered to her husband. Another excused herself quietly and left the room. The air smelled suddenly of shame, thick and suffocating. I was not there in person, but I heard every detail later from a neighbor who had peeked through the open doorway, horrified and fascinated. She told me how Daniel's friends began to gather their coats, murmuring apologies, unwilling to be associated with scandal. One by one, they slipped out, leaving him exposed in the center of the room. Melissa hissed at him under her breath, her eyes wild. "You told me it was ours. You promised." Daniel's hands shook as he set down the champagne glass, the bravado draining from him like water from a cracked vase. "It should have been," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The officer stepped forward again. "You have 24 hours to vacate or face legal removal. Utilities and accounts tied to this address are suspended until ownership is confirmed. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded slowly, his face pale, his jaw tight with fury he could not express. By the end of the night, the penthouse was nearly empty. The music had stopped. The laughter had died. Daniel stood among half-empty glasses and abandoned plates, staring at the city lights as if they had betrayed him too. Melissa stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door so hard a painting rattled against the wall. When my neighbor told me all this, I sat in silence, my hands folded in my lap. A strange calm settled over me. Not triumph, not gloating, but a quiet confirmation that cruelty always carries its own weight. My son had chosen greed over love, and greed had devoured him in front of everyone he wanted to impress. I pressed the wedding photo closer to my heart that evening and whispered to Richard, "You saw further than I ever did." Daniel's humiliation was not the end, only the beginning. There was still more truth to uncover, and I had more strength than I knew waiting inside me. After the night of Daniel's humiliation, I thought I had already witnessed the deepest cut life could deliver. But Charles told me there was one more thing Richard had left behind for me, something he had insisted be given only when I was ready. He opened a locked drawer in his desk, pulled out a thick envelope, and slid it across the polished wood. "Your husband wanted you to have this. He said it would give you strength when the world felt darkest." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in Richard's unmistakable handwriting and a small USB drive. My throat tightened. For a moment, I could not breathe. I carried the envelope home that evening as if it were made of glass. In the quiet of the penthouse, my penthouse now, I set the wedding photo on the table beside it. I stared at Richard's face in the photo, then at the neat script on the page, terrified of what I might find and yet unable to resist. The letter began simply, "My dearest Sylvia, if you are reading this, I am gone. I can imagine your eyes rolling at my formality. You always said I wrote contracts even when I wrote love notes, but please bear with me. These words are the closest I can come to standing beside you now. You gave me more than I ever deserved. For 43 years, you sacrificed quietly so I could succeed loudly. You mended everything I broke, carried everything I dropped, held everything I forgot. You believed in me when I doubted myself, and you raised our son with more patience than I ever showed. I know the weight you carried, and I know I did not always say thank you. So let me say it now, clearly, eternally. Thank you. You are stronger than you believe. You are wiser than anyone gave you credit for. And you are the reason this family had any foundation at all. I worried about Daniel. I worried he had learned too much from my ambition and too little from your humility. I saw entitlement in him, pride without gratitude. That is why I left safeguards in the will. If he treats you with dignity, he keeps his inheritance. If he does not, then everything is yours. I did this not to punish him, but to protect you. If Daniel has betrayed you, if he has cast you aside, then know this: the law and my love stand with you. You are not powerless. You are not disposable. You are not alone. Please, Sylvia, do not let sorrow bury you. Use what I left you to live as fully as you once dreamed. Paint again. Travel again. Stand tall and know that you are the queen of this story, not the pawn. Forever yours, Richard. By the time I finished reading, the words blurred through a veil of tears. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the USB. I pressed the letter to my chest, rocking gently like a child trying to comfort herself. The ache of missing him felt unbearable, yet in that ache was a thread of strength. He had seen me, he had known me, he had honored me. I plugged the USB into the laptop. Richard's voice filled the room, deep and steady, carrying the warmth I had leaned on for most of my life. If you're hearing this, Sylvia, it means my fears were right. It means Daniel's hunger for control outweighed his love. I prayed I was wrong. I prayed you would never need this. But if you do, let this remind you. You are the heart of everything we built. Not me, you. Do not bow to him. Do not believe you are less because he says so. You kept this family alive when I was too busy chasing contracts to notice. You are the reason we had a home, not just a house. And if Daniel cannot see that, then he does not deserve the wealth he tried to claim. Use what I left to protect yourself. And then, Sylvia, I beg you, use it to find joy again. Don't live only in grief. Live in power. Live in peace. The sound of his voice shattered me. I pressed my palms to my face and sobbed quietly, rocking with the rhythm of his words. It felt as though he were standing in the room, one hand on my shoulder, guiding me forward even from beyond the grave. When the recording ended, the silence was profound. I sat there for a long time, breathing slowly, letting the tears run their course. Then I wiped my cheeks, straightened my back, and looked around the room with new eyes. This was not just Richard's penthouse. It was mine. He had placed the crown in my hands. I touched the wedding photo again. I hear you, Richard, I whispered. I will not bow. I will not disappear. I will live. That night I slept for the first time in weeks. The grief was still there, but it no longer crushed me. Instead, it fueled me. Pain had turned into power. And as I closed my eyes, I knew the story was not finished. Daniel would come back, desperate and begging, but I would be ready. The morning after I listened to Richard's recording, I moved through the penthouse with a new steadiness. For the first time in weeks, I brewed coffee without my hands trembling. I opened curtains, letting sunlight flood into rooms that had felt haunted. I set the wedding photo back on the mantel, not as a relic of grief, but as a reminder of resilience. Richard's words were still echoing inside me. You are the queen of this story, not the pawn. It was just after noon when my phone rang. The name on the screen made my stomach clench. Daniel. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, letting silence deliver the answer he deserved. But something inside me urged me to pick up, not out of duty, but out of choice. His voice cracked as soon as I said hello. Mom, thank God you answered. I need your help. I leaned against the counter, holding the phone loosely, forcing myself to breathe evenly. What kind of help? They froze everything, he blurted. The bank accounts, the credit cards, even the utilities. Melissa is losing her mind. We can't pay for anything. They said you're the only one who can authorize a release. Please, Mom, I don't know what to do. I closed my eyes. 2 weeks ago, those words might have broken me. I might have rushed to soothe him, to fix his mistakes as I had done since he was a boy. But Richard's letter and voice replayed in my mind. You are not powerless. You are not disposable. You sound surprised, I said quietly. Daniel's tone grew sharper. Of course I'm surprised. I'm your son. I should be... He stopped, catching himself. Then his voice softened again, almost childlike. Please, Mom, you can't just watch me fall apart. I'm begging you. I let the silence stretch between us, long enough for him to squirm. Then I spoke, calm and deliberate. Do you remember what you said to me at your father's funeral, Daniel? You looked me in the eye and told me, we don't need you anymore. Go away. His breath hitched audibly. "Mom, I didn't mean it like that. I was stressed. Melissa was pressuring me. I wasn't thinking straight." I pressed the phone closer to my ear, my voice barely above a whisper. "Go away, that's what you told me. And now that is my answer to you." The silence on the other end was heavy, broken only by his ragged breathing. Finally, he muttered, "You can't mean that. You're my mother. You can't just abandon me." My hand trembled, but my resolve held. I am your mother, which is why this hurts more than anything. But you abandoned me first. You threw me out of my own home. You treated me like I was worthless. Actions have consequences, Daniel. He tried again, frantic now. "Please, Mom, just this once. Help me get back on my feet and I'll make it right. I cut him off, my tone sharper than he had ever heard. "No, Daniel. This is not about me fixing what you broke. This is about you facing what you chose. You cannot treat people as disposable and expect loyalty when the tide turns." His voice cracked. "So you're really going to let me drown?" I swallowed hard, my eyes filling with tears. "No, Daniel, you already jumped." I hung up before he could answer. My hand lingered on the phone, my heart aching with a mixture of grief and grim clarity. I wanted to collapse. I wanted to believe his desperation was genuine. But I also remembered Melissa's smirk in the elevator, Daniel's cold words at the funeral, the hollow echo of a door slamming behind me. For hours after, I paced the penthouse, wrestling with the storm inside me. The mother in me screamed to rush to him, to rescue him from his own ruin. The woman in me, the one Richard had honored in his will and in his letter, knew that rescuing him now would erase every boundary, every lesson. This is the conflict no one prepares you for, the choice between protecting your child and protecting your own dignity. Every parent wants to believe their love can redeem any mistake. But what happens when that love becomes the very excuse for betrayal? I sat in the quiet living room staring at the city skyline. My reflection stared back from the glass, older, steadier, sadder. I whispered to Richard's memory, "Was I cruel? Or was I finally strong?" Somewhere, deep down, I knew the answer. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to shield someone from the consequences they created. As night fell, I placed the phone face down on the table and poured myself a glass of water. My son's voice still echoed in my ears, pleading, desperate, but so did my own words. "Go away." For the first time, I realized those words were not just a rejection. They were a boundary. They were survival. And though my heart ached, my spirit felt steadier. This was not the end of the story. It was only the turning point. The knock came just after sunset, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the foyer like a summons. I was placing fresh tulips in a vase when the sound reached me. The stems trembled in my hand, dripping cold water onto the marble. I did not hurry. I set the flowers, wiped the spill with a folded cloth, and walked to the door with the slow steadiness of someone who has finally learned the weight of her own name. Through the peephole, I saw Daniel. His hair was uncombed, his suit hung like it belonged to another man. He looked older than he had any right to look. I opened the door but left the chain fastened. The hallway smelled faintly of furniture polish and someone's dinner. Far down the corridor, the elevator chimed and closed again. We were alone. "Mom," he whispered, "please." The single word scraped his throat. I slid off the chain and stepped back. He entered with hesitant steps, as if the floor might reject him. His eyes flicked to the mantel where the wedding photo stood like a small lighthouse. He swallowed and looked down. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you don't have a reason to believe me. I know what I said at the funeral was monstrous. I was angry. I was lost. I thought—" He stopped. The lies and excuses seemed to die in his mouth. "I don't have an excuse." He sank to his knees on the rug, the same rug he had once crawled across as a toddler chasing toy cars. His shoulders shook. The sight carved me open in places I thought were already scar tissue. There is no immunity against your child's tears. There is only the choice of what to do with them. "Please forgive me," he said, voice breaking. "Melissa is gone. The friends are gone. The bank said there is nothing. I am ashamed. I am scared. I don't know who I am if I am not the man who inherited everything." I stood with my back to the door, hands folded at my waist to keep them from reaching for him. "You are my son," I said, "and you are a man who chose greed over love." The sentence felt like a verdict, spoken gently, but it was a verdict all the same. He pressed his forehead to the edge of the rug. I know, I will make it right. I will work. I will pay back anything you want. Just say you forgive me. Say I am not that person anymore." The room carried the soft hum of the air vent and the distant pulse of traffic below. I let silence gather between us until it grew heavy enough to be felt. My mind walked the old roads, his first fever, his first broken heart, the nights I ironed, shirts while he studied, the day he left for college with a promise to call every Sunday. Love is a country with 1,000 borders. I had crossed them all for him. "Look at me, Daniel," I said. He lifted his face, eyes red, cheeks wet. He looked 12 again, then 30, then 12. He looked like my son and a stranger in the same frame. "I believe you are sorry," I said. "I believe you are terrified, but the apology does not erase the act. Forgiveness does not erase consequences." He flinched as if I had struck him. "Then what am I supposed to do?" "Live with what you did. Learn from it. Build something honest with your own hands. Return what you took when you can. Make amends where the law directs and where your conscience does not let you sleep. That is how grown men begin again." He crawled closer on his knees until he was at my feet. He reached for my hands. I did not give them. His fingers hovered in the air, helpless. "Please," he whispered, "call the bank. Tell them to unfreeze one account so I can survive." I shook my head. "No." "Because you hate me?" "Because I love you," I said, and my voice surprised me with its steadiness. "Because if I save you now, I teach you nothing, except that your mother will always remove the cost of your choices. You told me to go away. I am giving your words back to you, not as a punishment, but as a mirror." He bowed his head. A sound left him that was not quite a sob and not quite a word. He stayed there for a long moment, gathering whatever pieces were left. When he finally stood, he swayed, then found his balance like a man learning to walk after an accident. "I do not deserve your kindness," he said. "You are correct," I answered. "Kindness is not a debt, it is a gift. Today, I am not the giver you want. One day, perhaps, when the work is real." He glanced again at the wedding photo. "Dad would have understood me," he muttered, a last reflex of the old arrogance. "Your father understood you perfectly," I said. "That is why he wrote the will the way he did." Something in his posture gave way. He nodded once, a small motion that read like surrender. He took 2 steps backward. "I will try," he said. "I will try to be someone you could trust again." "Then try," I said. We walked to the door together. He hesitated on the threshold. The hallway light washed his face a tired yellow. For a second, I saw the boy who had run down this hallway with untied shoes and a backpack bouncing. I wanted to smooth his hair. I wanted to press a sandwich into his palm and tell him to be brave. I wanted 100 tender things. I did none of them. He whispered, "Do you forgive me?" I answered carefully, each word set down like a stone in a river. Forgiveness is possible. Access is not. Not today. His eyes filled again. He nodded, gathered what pride he had left, and stepped into the hall. I placed my hand on the door. "Daniel." Looked up. "Do the work," I said. "Then knock." I closed the door without another word. The latch clicked. The chain slid home with a small metallic sigh. On the other side, I heard nothing. Not a footstep, not a sob, only the quiet of consequence taking its seat. I stood with my forehead against the wood until the tremor in my hands steadied. Then I turned back to the room that was mine and walked to the mantel. I lifted the wedding photo and set it higher where the light caught it clean. After closing the door on Daniel, I sat in silence for a long time. My body trembled with the weight of what had just happened. My son had knelt in front of me, begging for forgiveness, and I had stood firm. Forgiveness, I knew, was not the same as absolution. Consequences must remain. When the tears dried on my face, I realized something. I could no longer live only in defense. I had to live in purpose. The will had given me wealth beyond anything I ever imagined. $31 million from Richard's careful planning, plus the portion Daniel had lost through his cruelty. I could have hidden it away, could have wrapped myself in silence and isolation. But every time I looked at the wedding photo, every time I replayed Richard's voice on that recording, one truth rose higher than fear. He had not asked me to survive. He had asked me to live. That was how the Sylvia Morgan Foundation was born. It began with a single conversation in Charles Bennett's office. "I want to help people like me," I told him. "Women discarded by their families, seniors who gave everything and were left with nothing. No one should face that kind of betrayal alone." Charles nodded, already pulling out legal pads. A charitable trust, independent board oversight, focused mission. Within weeks, the paperwork was filed. The foundation's mission was clear: to provide legal aid, housing assistance, and counseling for elderly individuals suffering financial abuse at the hands of their own families. We hired advocates, partnered with shelters, and built a hotline staffed 24 hours a day. The first time I walked into the office space we rented downtown, I felt more alive than I had in years. Volunteers bustled, phones rang, and a banner with my name stretched across the entrance. For a moment, embarrassment warmed my cheeks. I had never wanted to see my name in lights. But then I thought about the motel room, the cracked ceiling, the silence after being told, "Go away." If putting my name forward meant one more woman would find the courage to stand tall, then so be it. The press found the story irresistible. "Widow turns betrayal into beacon," one headline read. Another called me the mother who fought back. Television crews filmed me speaking at a fundraiser, my voice steadier than I ever imagined it could be. "We cannot choose the families we are born into," I told the audience, "but we can choose what kind of family we become for one another. This foundation is that choice." Applause rose, filling the hall like a tide. For once I did not shrink from it, but while cameras celebrated, another story unfolded quietly across the city. Daniel, stripped of access to accounts, drifted from couch to couch, surviving on borrowed money and dwindling pride. Melissa had left, her diamond rings pawned, her promises broken. He no longer dressed in tailored suits. Instead, he wore the uniform of defeat, wrinkled shirts, shoes scuffed from sidewalks instead of marble floors. One afternoon, a friend forwarded me a photo from a local newspaper. It showed Daniel sitting on a park bench, head in his hands, as the article beside it detailed the foundation's work. The juxtaposition was cruel in its clarity. A son undone by greed, a mother rising from the ashes of betrayal. I stared at the photo for a long time. My heart clenched, but not with regret. It was sorrow mixed with inevitability. Daniel had written this chapter himself. I could not erase his handwriting. Still, I whispered into the quiet, "I hope you learn, my son. I hope the empty hands teach you what full ones never did." The media attention only grew. Networks invited me to speak about elder abuse. Lawmakers contacted me for input on new protections. Each time I stepped before a microphone, I thought of all the invisible Sylvias sitting in dim rooms, clutching photographs, wondering if anyone would believe their stories. I spoke for them. I carried their voices alongside mine. At night, when the lights of the city blinked outside the penthouse windows, I allowed myself small smiles. I had been told to go away, to disappear. Instead, I had found a way to stay, not only for myself, but for countless others. And though Daniel's face haunted me, the contrast between us only sharpened the lesson. Love without respect collapses. Wealth without gratitude decays. Power without compassion destroys itself. The foundation was not revenge. It was renewal. It was my way of saying to the world and to Richard that betrayal would not have the final word. The applause, the interviews, the headlines, those were noise. What mattered were the letters that arrived daily, written in shaky handwriting. "You saved me," one woman wrote. "Because of your foundation, I left the nursing home my son abandoned me in. I feel alive again." I folded those letters carefully and placed them beside Richard's. They were proof that pain could be alchemized into purpose. Proof that I had not only survived Daniel's cruelty, but transformed it into something larger than either of us. The work was just beginning. The foundation was barely a month old when Charles asked me to come in again. His voice on the phone carried a tightness I had not heard before, the kind that appears when numbers stop behaving. When I arrived, files stood like small buildings across his desk. A highlighter bled beside a legal pad marked with arrows and dates. "Something is wrong," he said. While the bank moved quickly to freeze major accounts, several transfers were initiated in the 48 hours after Richard's funeral, and just before the freeze took effect. The paperwork looks legitimate, but it is not. He rotated a document toward me. Richard's signature had been copied with confidence. Even the notary's seal looked true. Charles tapped the margin. "This notary retired 3 years ago. The office is a mailbox. Someone staged authenticity." My stomach tightened. Daniel and Melissa," he answered. "Wire requests were routed through an intermediary account for a shell company. The registered agent matches a firm tied to Melissa's cousin. I believe Melissa assembled the paperwork while Daniel supplied credentials he never should have had." "How much did they move?" "Not everything," he said. "A cluster of accounts, enough to do harm if we do not act. The transfers were flagged. Some funds are in transit holds. We have a narrow window." He put the bank's fraud unit on speaker. A woman named Adrian briefed us with cool precision. Transaction paths, IP logs, device IDs. "Requests originated from a device registered to Melissa Hayes," she said. "Traffic bounced through a VPN, but we can correlate MAC addresses from a repair ticket." Charles scribbled notes. "We will need a forensic accountant." "I have someone," I said. "A volunteer at the foundation retired from a white-collar squad. She knows this terrain." By morning, she was in the conference room building a timeline. Transfers queued at odd hours. Authorizations pushed from a compromised email. 2 small custodial accounts retitled with a barely altered middle initial. "Old trick," she said. "Change a letter and hope grief hides the rest." I folded my hands and breathed through the anger. While I slept in a motel, my son and his wife moved chess pieces with my name on them. Charles filed emergency motions. The court issued temporary restraining orders. The bank froze the intermediary accounts and notified federal investigators. "Be prepared," he said. "This will not remain a private matter. We are tipping into fraud, forgery, and wire crimes." "Let it tip," I answered. "Let it land where truth lives." The investigation widened. Subpoenas went out. Carriers released location data. A print shop produced logs showing the model used to replicate a notary's seal. 2 investigators visited my penthouse. I answered everything. News arrived in steady drops. Melissa visited a copy shop in Queens 2 days after the funeral. Security footage showed her paying cash for sealed envelopes. The shell company was registered from a cafe near the park where Daniel was photographed on that bench. Melissa's email opened the account. Daniel's login attempted the first transfer 30 minutes later. She was the architect, he the apprentice. Together they built a house of paper and arrogance. I wanted rage. Instead, I felt a colder metal. resolve edged with grief. The boy I raised let fear make him a thief. The woman he married used my mourning as cover. Charles called again. The prosecutors want a meeting, he said. They are reviewing charges: elder financial abuse, forgery, attempted wire fraud, conspiracy. At the district attorney's office, a young prosecutor laid the case out. Transfers, forged authorizations, a notary's seal reproduced on a commercial machine, calls between Melissa and registered agent minutes before each request. "Mrs. Morgan," she said, "we believe Melissa Hayes designed the plan and Daniel Morgan executed key steps." I pictured Daniel on his knees in my foyer. Then I pictured him typing passwords while the ink on his father's death certificate was still drying. Forgive means to release a debt. It does not erase the ledger. "What happens now?" I asked. "We will present to a grand jury," she said. "In the meantime, avoid contact. If they reach out, do not respond. All communications should go through counsel." That night, I stood at the window holding the wedding photo. The city glowed. Richard's recorded voice returned. "Live in power, live in peace." I could not change what Daniel and Melissa had done. I could decide who I would be while the law did its work. I set the photo beside my notebook and wrote 3 lines. Protect the vulnerable, insist on boundaries, trust the process. In the morning, a headline appeared about an unnamed Manhattan couple under investigation for elder fraud. I made oatmeal, answered foundation emails, approved emergency grants for clients who needed housing and legal counsel. Then Melissa made a mistake. She called one of our foundation's intake lines using a disguised number and asked pointed questions about how quickly banks respond to freezes and how to challenge a notary's commission. The call was recorded, the number traced, prosecutors added it to the file. By noon, Charles phoned again. "The knot is tightening," he said. "This is the pivot." I looked around the penthouse that had once felt like a mausoleum and now felt like a command center. "Then let it turn," I said, steady as breath. "I am ready for the law to speak." The courthouse smelled faintly of varnish and old paper, the kind of place where time feels slower, where every word carries weight. I walked through the metal detectors with Charles at my side. My shoes clicked softly against the marble floors, steady and measured. In my bag, the wedding photo rested between folders, a quiet reminder of why I was here. Inside the courtroom, rows of benches stretched back, filled with curious onlookers and reporters scribbling notes. I chose a seat behind the prosecution table, close enough to see Daniel's profile when he turned his head. He sat rigid in a dark suit that no longer fit. His hair had grown too long, his eyes sunken. Melissa sat. Beside him, posture straight, face carefully arranged into innocence. If not for the tension in her jaw, she might have convinced strangers she was the victim. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The gavel struck once, echoing sharp as glass. The prosecutor, a woman named Harris, began with clarity. "Your Honor, members of the court, today we present evidence that Daniel Morgan and his wife, Melissa Hayes, engaged in deliberate elder financial abuse, forged legal documents, and attempted to commit large-scale financial fraud against Mrs. Sylvia Morgan, Daniel's own mother." The words landed like stones dropped in water. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. My hands clasped in my lap. I focused on breathing, slow and steady, though my pulse hammered. Harris continued, "We will show records of forged authorizations, transfers of funds through shell companies, and falsified notary stamps used to attempt the illegal retitling of accounts. We will show how Melissa Hayes initiated communication with intermediaries, orchestrating the deception, while Daniel Morgan supplied insider information and login credentials. Their intent was to strip Mrs. Morgan of her rightful inheritance and leave her destitute. On the defense side, Melissa leaned close to whisper to her attorney. Daniel stared at the table, his shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths. The prosecution called Adrienne, the bank fraud investigator. She testified with calm precision, pointing to enlarged documents displayed on screens for the jury. This notary seal, she explained, was reproduced using a commercial machine. The real notary retired in 2020. The forged document was submitted under Melissa Hayes' email account. The defense objected, claiming circumstantial evidence. The judge overruled. Next came the forensic accountant, who traced the movement of funds. These transfers, he said, were queued within hours of Richard Morgan's funeral. Each attempt originated from a device registered to Melissa Hayes. The requests used Daniel Morgan's authorization codes. I watched the jurors scribble notes, their faces tightening as patterns became clear. Finally, the prosecutor called me to the stand. My palms dampened as I took the oath, then sat facing the courtroom. Harris asked gently, "Mrs. Morgan, did you ever authorize your son or daughter-in-law to move these funds?" "No," I said, my voice steadier than expected. "I was never even told there was a reading of my husband's will. I was thrown out of my own home 2 days after his funeral. I was told I had nothing." A hush fell over the room. My words needed no embellishment. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination. Melissa's eyes glistened theatrically as he asked, "Is it possible, Mrs. Morgan, that your son and his wife were only trying to protect you from the burden of financial management? That their actions, while clumsy, were meant to ensure your safety?" Held his gaze. Protect me by forging documents? Protect me by throwing me into a motel with 2 suitcases and $200 in cash? If that is protection, then I prefer the truth. The gallery stirred again. Even the judge's expression hardened. Melissa broke her silence, leaning forward. "We only wanted to help her," she said loudly, her voice cracking. "She doesn't understand complex finances. We thought it was safer in our hands. We never meant harm." The prosecutor turned toward her, calm as ice. "Mrs. Hayes, do you deny sending these transfer requests from your device? Do you deny contacting the registered agent tied to the shell company?" Melissa faltered. I don't recall." The prosecutor lifted a printed log. "Your Honor, here are time-stamped records of her login activity. Here is surveillance footage of her at the copy shop printing forged notarizations. Her help was fraud, plain and simple." The jury watched Melissa shrink into her chair. Daniel covered his face with his hand, unable to look at anyone. I sat in stillness, my spine straight, my breath steady. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply let the truth land where it belonged. Forgiveness could wait. Justice was speaking now. By the time court adjourned for the day, the weight of evidence had pressed itself into every corner of the room. Reporters hurried out, whispering headlines. Melissa dabbed her eyes with a tissue, still muttering to her lawyer. Daniel avoided even glancing at me as he was escorted past, his steps unsteady. I rose quietly, gathered my bag, and walked out beneath the carved archways of the courthouse. Outside, cameras flashed, voices called my name, but I moved past them into the open air. The sky was gray, heavy with rain. Yet as I lifted my face to it, I felt something clearer than weather. Vindication without vengeance, justice without cruelty. The trial was far from over, but the truth had found its footing. The courtroom was colder on the final day, or perhaps it was only my own body bracing for what was about to come. I sat in the same bench where I had listened to weeks of testimony, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the wedding photo tucked inside my purse like a private talisman. I did not come for spectacle. I came for closure. The judge entered, robes swaying, gavel striking once. "This court is now in session. We are here to deliver sentencing in the matter of Daniel Morgan and Melissa Hayes, charged with elder financial abuse, forgery, and attempted fraud." I heard Daniel's sharp inhale beside his attorney. Melissa sat upright, her chin high, as if posture alone could shield her. Cameras from the press were barred, but sketch artists poised their pencils, ready to capture every line of shame. The prosecutor summarized, "Your Honor, The evidence has been overwhelming. Forged notarizations, falsified transfers, and direct testimony confirm the defendant's deliberate intent to deprive Mrs. Morgan of her rightful inheritance. We request sentencing consistent with the gravity of these crimes. The defense pled for leniency. Daniel's lawyer spoke of stress, of grief, of poor judgment. Melissa's attorney painted her as a misguided wife overwhelmed by financial complexity. I listened without shifting in my seat. Words could twist, but evidence had already spoken. The judge leaned forward, voice steady as stone. This court finds Daniel Morgan guilty of attempted financial fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. However, mitigating factors, including lack of prior record and demonstrated remorse, have been considered. Mr. Morgan is hereby sentenced to 5 years suspended sentence with 2 years of probation, restitution to Mrs. Morgan in the amount of $1 million, and mandatory counseling for financial ethics. Daniel bowed his head, shoulders slumping, his hands gripping the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He did not look at me. Perhaps he could not. Then the judge turned. Melissa Hayes, evidence shows you were the architect of this scheme. You created forged documents, coordinated fraudulent accounts, and encouraged your husband's betrayal of his own mother. The court considers you the principal actor. You are hereby sentenced to 3 years in state prison with no suspension and restitution jointly with Mr. Morgan. Gasps filled the gallery. Melissa stiffened. For a moment, her eyes flashed with the same arrogance she had carried in the elevator when she closed the doors on me. But arrogance trembles when steel closes in. The bailiff approached, handcuffs in hand. "Stand, Mrs. Hayes." She rose slowly, her designer jacket brushing against the wooden chair. Her mouth curled into something between defiance and fear. "This is absurd," she hissed, but her voice cracked. The bailiff secured the cuffs around her wrists. The metallic click echoed through the chamber like a final verdict. She tried to maintain composure, lifting her chin as though still superior, but her fingers twitched nervously, betraying what pride could not hide. For the first time, Melissa looked less like a victor and more like a woman realizing the walls were real, and the exit was gone. Daniel reached toward her, but his attorney placed a firm hand on his arm. He remained seated, silent, watching as the woman he had followed into deception was led away. And me? I did not smile. I did not gloat. I watched with the same stillness I had carried since the beginning, silent strength. My husband's letter echoed in my mind, and so did my own words to Daniel. Forgiveness does not erase consequences. As Melissa passed me, her eyes flicked to mine. For a fraction of a second, the arrogance faltered. A tremor crossed her lips. Then she looked away, hurried by the bailiff toward the door that would close behind her for years. The judge struck the gavel once more. This court is adjourned. Chairs scraped. Murmurs rose. Reporters whispered headlines. I remained seated, letting the noise wash over me. Around me, people rushed for exits, eager to relay the drama outside. But I sat still, absorbing the weight of what had transpired. My son's future narrowed by probation and restitution. His wife's arrogance exchanged for iron cuffs. And me, the woman they tried to erase, still here. I finally stood and walked slowly toward the exit. Daniel glanced up as I passed. His lips parted as if to form a plea or apology, but no sound emerged. I did not stop. I did not speak. I let the silence answer for me. Outside the courthouse, the sky broke open with sunlight. Reporters clustered, questions flying, microphones raised. "Mrs. Morgan, how do you feel? Do you think justice was done? Will you reconcile with your son?" I paused on the steps, my face calm, my hands folded at my waist. I spoke only once. Consequences are things that cannot be erased. The words hung in the air, heavier than any headline. I descended the steps, each stride steady, the noise fading behind me. The city moved as it always did, buses roaring, strangers hurrying, the world indifferent. But inside me, something was different. Not triumph, not revenge, simply truth, settled like a stone finally placed where it belonged. When I reached home, I placed the wedding photo back on the mantel and whispered to Richard's smile, "It is finished." 6 months passed, and the penthouse no longer felt like a mausoleum. Fresh paint warmed the walls, new curtains caught the light, and the space finally reflected me instead of the shadows of grief. On a quiet morning, I stood by the wide windows with a porcelain teacup in hand, steam rising against the pale dawn. The city stretched out before me, not as a battlefield, but as a horizon. For the first time in years, I felt at home. The Sylvia Morgan Foundation had grown faster than I imagined. What began with a single idea in Charles's office had become a refuge for dozens of seniors who had been manipulated, abandoned, or stripped of their savings by those they trusted most. We had secured housing for a widow left homeless by her son's schemes. We had provided legal aid to a grandfather nearly defrauded by a relative. Each story was another echo of mine, and each victory felt like a healing stitch pulled through the torn fabric of memory. One afternoon, as I reviewed letters at the foundation's office, a woman in her 70s entered with hesitant steps. Her clothes were plain, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn purse. She looked at me for a long moment before bursting into tears. I rose quickly, guiding her into a chair, holding her hand until her breathing steadied. "You don't know me," she whispered, "but you saved me. Your foundation stopped my nephew from taking my house. Without you, I would have been on the street." She leaned forward, wrapping her arms around me in an embrace that smelled, faintly, of lavender and soap. I closed my eyes, my throat tightening. In her gratitude, I saw a mirror of myself on that night in the motel room, broken, frightened, believing I had been discarded. To be the one who could now say, "You are not alone," felt like the completion of a circle I never thought would close. When she finally left, her face brighter than when she entered, I sat for a long time in silence. That hug weighed more than any award, more than the praise of reporters or politicians. It was proof that suffering could become seed, that betrayal could be compost for hope. Later that evening, I returned to the penthouse. The room smelled faintly of fresh lilies, the kind Richard once brought home on anniversaries. I poured another cup of tea, curled into the chair by the window, and let the city's evening lights rise like constellations. I whispered softly into the quiet. Life doesn't end at 68. It is only just beginning. I thought of Daniel. Probation had spared him a cell, but not the long shadow of shame. I hoped he was learning, even if slowly, that consequence is not cruelty, but a teacher. Melissa's absence from his side was its own kind of silence. Yet even as their futures twisted, I no longer carried their weight in my chest. I had released it, not in forgiveness alone, but in choosing to build something larger than pain. The foundation, the letters, the embraces, these were my new chapters, and the penthouse, once filled with echoes of rejection, now hummed with resilience. Before we say goodbye, I would love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone with gratitude. And if my story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. Remember, sometimes the miracle does not knock on your door. It waits quietly until you are ready to open your heart. Take care, and I will see you in the next story.